Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, who is the Executive Director of the Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Daniel, good to see you today.
Good morning, Dr. Ball.
Well, very good. We have a special guest today, a real friend of Liberty, and interesting enough, he's going to be calling in from Brussels. But he is definitely a friend of Liberty, and that's Daniel Hannan. And he's well known. He was well known in the fight for Brexit, and I believe he's going to have a lot of interesting things to talk about on what's going on with the British government and where we stand on Brexit. Daniel, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be here, Dr. Paul. Big fan.
Well, wonderful. Let's start off. I did see a recent article that you wrote, and you're a professional writer, and you do so well. But the one that was a very catchy title was "The Working Class versus the Smirking Class." Why don't you just very briefly give us an introduction to that, because that really talks about so much of the issue that's going on right now. And I might suggest one thing, is I've come up with a term that says that we live in the age of arrogance. And I'm just wondering whether those two may be similar.
Well, you're quite right. I mean, the smirking class in this case were lobbyists, the elites, the corporatists, the mega banks and the big multinationals that poured energy and finances into the campaign to keep us into the European Union, while dismissing all the democratic and libertarian and internationalist concerns of the other side and painting us all as xenophobes and nativists and bigots. And here's the thing about the smirking class. Here's the thing about the experts. If only they really were experts. But on this, as on so many issues, the consensus of all the smart, educated people was wrong, and the instinct of the majority was right.
Right. Daniel?
Exactly. It's an excellent point you make, Daniel, that it was portrayed in the media, especially here, as this xenophobic push by the Brits. They couldn't stand anyone different than them. They had to leave the EU because of it. But as you point out, really it was optimism that motivated the voters to choose to leave. They wanted to build a stronger UK, a better economy. It had very little to do with the other.
Of course, there are some people who don't want immigration, and I'm not going to deny that some of those people voted leave because they wanted to reduce migration from the main question for most Leave voters. All of our internal polls showed what all the published polls showed, which is that the biggest issue for Leave voters was democracy. And far from having voted for a nativist or protectionist Britain, for a Britain that raises its drawbridges, our contention as Leave campaigners is that Britain will flourish more as a global economy, a free trading, deregulated, low-tax economy outside an over-regulated, overtaxed, and inward-looking European Union.
Yes, and you make a very good point too about the globalism. A lot of times people who see what we're trying to do, and we don't want bigger, more international global government and more global regulations, that doesn't mean you can't be oriented toward globalism in the free market sense, that actually trade becomes better and more productive and better for the people and more fair and not kowtowing to the politicians and the very wealthy people. And I think that is so much the point. And I also see some of this free trade that I believe is good free trade and globalism is the moral right of an individual to spend his or her money the way they see fit, which means that people make the choices rather than some bureaucrat writing regulations. And then when it came to the story about how Brussels write the regulations in gross detail for the various countries, and the British people finally said, why is it that they're doing this? And they were delighted to respond to your efforts and others to say that enough is enough and we need to break away from this tyranny coming from the European Union.
Yeah, I think you put it very well indeed. If the European Union were just a free trade area, if the European Union were just a forum for neighboring countries to arbitrate their disputes and do things collectively that they can't achieve singly, no one would have had a problem with it, right? You'd have to be completely mad to be against the idea of working with your immediate neighbors and allies. Our problem with the EU is that it presumed to regulate almost everything. There was virtually no field of public or private life that wasn't on some level touched by Brussels regulation. Britain is an internationalist country. We're an outward-looking people. We're connected by our language, by our legal system, by migration patterns to every continent. And outside the European Union, we will be a better place to do business, we'll be a more open economy, we'll be a more global economy. And I will make a bet with you now. Actually, I'm sure you wouldn't take this bet, but I'll make a prediction for liberty-minded viewers that there will be a genuinely trade agreement between the UK and the US that doesn't work for the interests of big corporates, but that works for consumers on both sides of the Atlantic, long before there is any free trade deal between the US and the European Union.
Yeah.
Daniel, if I may, this is something that is somewhat perplexing to us on this side. You have a major leadership change coming up on Wednesday. Kind of a surprise move. It wasn't supposed to happen until October. Theresa May will take over as the UK's second Prime Minister. We found it very interesting that it seems all of the lead campaigners for the Brexit vote have stepped aside. Nigel Farage, a different party, obviously, but also Andrea Leadsom, Boris Johnson, they've stepped aside, and a sort of a moderately pro-EU Prime Minister comes in. What does this mean? Why are the leaders of the movement stepping aside, and what does it mean that your new Prime Minister is not super enthusiastic about leaving?
Well, them's the rules. It's not that they stepped aside, it's that they didn't have enough support from Conservative members of Parliament. Our system is not like yours. Our system is a parliamentary, not a presidential one. If you want to be Prime Minister, you have to be able to command a majority in the House of Commons. And the reality is that the House of Commons is mainly made up of people who wanted to stay in the European Union. However, Theresa May is a good Democrat. She's made very, very clear that she accepts the verdict of the referendum. Brexit is going to happen. And the only question for us now, in an amicable, orderly, and mutually beneficial way, right? I want Brexit to be done in a way that brings advantages to us, but that also brings advantages to our friends and allies in Europe. We have a continuing, permanent interest in their prosperity. The last thing we want to do is to leave the EU in a way that might, for example, trigger another crisis in the Eurozone. So we need to get this right in a manner that maximizes the advantages to both sides. And I think Theresa May will do that.
There have been some, and I think you included, have indicated that there are some foreign policy things that contribute to this chaos that we suffer and even the Brits suffer from. And that is the support for the ongoing wars in the Middle East, the breakdown of governments there, and then the problems in Syria. And then the emphasis that has placed on mass migration, and then the whole thing about migrants going to the countries that have the best welfare system. And the people naturally, I think, would get annoyed with this, especially if the country and the world are dealing with an economic system that really isn't a viable system, and there's a lot of debt and a lot of bankruptcies here and a lot of pressure. It's very easy for people to get annoyed and also leap over to maybe supranationalism, saying, it's all their fault. But I think recognizing that foreign policy and migration and the breakdown of so many systems in the Middle East certainly contribute to some of the frustrations that the people feel.
I think that's true. I mean, look, I'm a very limited government guy, as you are. But the core traditional functions of any state are, first of all, to maintain the integrity of the national territory. In other words, to be able to decide who comes in and who doesn't, and whether they're doing so legally and on what terms and what benefits they can claim. And secondly, to control the economy, or at least to arbitrate it as the referee. Now, what we've seen in the European Union is two disasters: the Schengen area, which abolished the frontiers, and then the Eurozone. Both of these have worked very, very badly. And I think that's served to discredit the whole European project in the eyes of a lot of Europeans. And it made people in Britain think, you know, we can do better without this. We can do better running our own affairs.
Daniel.
On the same topic of foreign policy, Daniel, now you've been, I think, very sensible and a realist when it comes to foreign policy. You've opposed the adventures in Libya. You certainly came to oppose the Iraq adventure. My guess is you're casting a skeptical eye on the whole Syria overthrow process. But isn't it somewhat ironic that the regime change project for Syria that produced this mass migration problem possibly fueled, to a degree, as you mentioned earlier, this desire to separate from the dictates of Brussels? It seems like Merkel and company shot themselves in the foot with this one.
I was against the Iraq war at the time. I don't think I always go as far as the good doctor on foreign policy. I mean, I'm glad that you guys joined the Second World War in our defense, and I'm glad that we won the Cold War, but I was certainly against the Iraq intervention. I don't think that this refugee crisis is just about foreign policy. I think there's something else going on. Migration of peoples made possible by rising wealth and rising access to technology. I spent part of last summer volunteering in a hostel for underage migrants in Italy, people who just crossed the Mediterranean from Libya. And what was very striking is when you saw people disembarking, the first thing they would do is ask whether there was Wi-Fi, right? They had smartphones. Now, these were people who were coming from great poverty, but the smartphone was what made the journey possible. It allowed them to access credit, it allowed them to plan the journey, it allowed their relatives to send things to the people that they needed to get them through. In other words, this rising technology has made possible these mass journeys, these transcontinental journeys, that the grandparents of these boys, you know, living on subsistence agriculture, couldn't have contemplated. So wars or no wars, the world is going to be facing massive population movements. And one of the issues that we need to determine is how we regulate those popular flows in a way that are fair. You know, we live in an imperfect world. You're right about the people shopping for welfare. You know, I mean, all sorts of libertarians would say, well, of course, in a perfect world, there'd be a different benefits model, and then we could have open borders. But that's not the world we live in. And until we do live in that world, or unless we live in that world, we're going to have to do something about determining who can come in and who can't. Oh,
very good. Daniel, we have a couple minutes left, but we're going to have to cut it off because our communications aren't real good. I believe this is a great interview and a great discussion. I wish we could keep going on, and maybe we can get back together again. But I want to thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. And I want to acknowledge to our audience, I appreciate very much for you joining in as well. Please come back to the Liberty Report soon.